everyone. So nice to see you here in such a lovely, warm environment. So we here are having excellent partners in this conversation. So Chris and JJ. JJ is from Black Unicorn and Chris is from. Please
The
help me.
French Tech Journal, and
Yes.
now Series Z podcasts telling tech European stories.
So we have two different parts of media relations, PR and media and journalists, and we will talking about what's happening in diversity topic here. What can each of us can do to make it all better? So let's start. So my first question is, why at all diversity is so important in media?
Want me to start? Well, I think it's essential. And to clarify, talking about in terms of the stories we do or the people participating in making the media? Or
Both.
Well, I think both are frankly quite important, particularly in Europe at this moment, because my background is from Silicon Valley, where the diversity issues are entrenched over many decades. And Europe is still quite young. And we see some of the same unfortunate trends emerging here in terms of participation for female entrepreneurs, for investment raised, etc. But I think the ecosystem here is still young enough where there's really an opportunity to make an impact in hopefully changing that trajectory. So in terms of the media, having both women at this moment participating in writing and identifying those stories from a female perspective, but also in general making sure that the breadth of experience is really representative is critical at this particular moment to kind of help address those imbalances.
Yeah, I totally agree with Chris. And, we're talking about technology a lot, and of course it's an extremely male-dominated industry, unfortunately, at this stage, when we're talking backstage just right now. However, what we want to make sure is that we have all the voices out there, that everyone can speak, everyone can speak up. And if we create technology, just by the gentlemen, by the guys, then we're kind of missing out quite a bit on, what women can bring to the table.
Okay, now we know why it's important. How to talk about it, how to talk about diversity. Let's start now with you because you are making the stories.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the most important, there are a couple of important things, right? So first and foremost, you have to be honest and transparent, right? You do not want to use diversity just as a gimmick, just a PR stunt for the sake of just doing something, right? So let's say if you do have all the male partners in a startup and then you just want to look a little bit more cool and hip and diverse and you just, invite perhaps junior level, women just to join in the photo op, that's not necessarily kind of the right way to do diversity. Like what you need to make sure is that there's a nice and fostering culture for women to be able to talk about things, once again, speak up and just, be heard. But honesty, transparency, not all of us are perfect, right? Well, probably none of us are perfect. So what's more than important is just to make sure that we're very straightforward and we try to do whatever it takes, just to foster that culture.
And what can media do, journalists?
Well, I think there's two things. First, and I would echo a lot of what was just said here, thinking about it in two ways. You do, of course, want to talk about the topic because it is critical to be talking about it at conferences and publications, etc. But you want to be a bit selective about that. So you don't want every story about a woman founder or investor, for example, to be about how remarkable it is that they are a woman in this field. In some respects, you have to naturally include that as well, just in your coverage, that you're making sure that for instance, I write a weekly newsletter in French Tech. I do a Seed of the Week feature. So I try to intentionally make sure that there's a healthy mix of women founders being included in those selections. But I don't necessarily say, hey, look, it's a woman founder, and that's the only reason I picked it. It's just when someone comes and looks at that, they see, okay, there's that mix. And again, certainly then there are those distinct stories because as we know, there are specific challenges that whether we're talking specifically about women or other diversity-related categories that people face. So you do those stories, but you don't only do those stories. You have to kind of normalize the inclusion of people across everything you're doing.
What are the biggest challenges you are seeing in your work when covering diversity?
Well, if I'm looking at the second part and just trying to be representative of how I'm doing this, it's the structural numbers that we see in the ecosystem. So again, if I'm using this example of this Seed of the Week feature, if I look at my inbox, who's pitching me, who's sending me PR about their fundraising, it's 95% male-founded companies. If I go into a database like Deal Room and I try to look up, okay, what are the choices that I have the last couple weeks, it's still men. And so you've got to force yourself as a habit to go that extra mile, that extra effort, and you don't want to complain. It has to be a reflex. It just has to be naturally part of the workflow as a journalist. And then, I would be interested to get your thoughts on this, both of you, but again, that inbox inflow that I see, it seems pretty clear that men are much more comfortable, whether they're probably at that stage so small they're not using a PR agency or an official spokesperson. They're just more comfortable putting themselves out, putting their hand up, sending me unsolicited stuff, which is fine, rather than compared to women. And again, you guys could speak more to that piece of why that might be, but it seems, I don't want to get into pop psychology about it, but again, the trend of my inbox is pretty clear in that regard.
Could you give some advice to women what to do, how to reach you out, how to make interest about them?
Well, my advice to women is kind of similar to my advice to anybody, but it is to really be thinking about an aspect of storytelling and networking with media early on. Even if, particularly if you're at a stage, a seed, pre-seed stage where you're really developing your first product, you may not necessarily be thinking about media attention because you don't really have something to sell. You don't have a product. If I do a story and someone clicks on the link and goes to your website, you don't have anything to give them. So why worry about promoting it? But I think in many ways, particularly at that early stage, it's a good time to start thinking about building that media network in much the same way that you think about doing that for your talent network, your investment network. It's very similar in that respect. And I think also in the media part, and this goes to heart of what you probably do with clients, but I find it's also a healthy exercise to start thinking about storytelling early on, because it helps refine your thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're trying to accomplish, your ability to explain yourself to the media, to a potential partner, investor, hire. There are similar dynamics there that you want to get across very quickly the point of what you're doing. If you can't do that, that suggests maybe you haven't thought through what you're doing. So again, even if it's not to put out a PR press release or get media coverage, the act of thinking about storytelling can be healthy, I think.
If we are talking about diversity, what are the things that are newsworthy for media? What is okay to send and what is totally no?
Well, there's a lot of things that are okay to send, and I totally agree with Chris that it's all about the storytelling, right? So you can't just right away, because there's just a female, and that's the only news that you can have out there. You have to be quite smart in terms of the storytelling, as we were just talking. But the storytelling comes in different shapes and forms as well, right? So it can be a female-led company that just raised X amount of money. It can be, top 10 women to look out in, let's say, the insurtech space. There's just so many different things that you can do. But I think when it comes to storytelling, depending who you're trying to pitch, a story or a press release, you have to be very well acquainted with what that particular journalist is writing about, right? You need to know the beats, understand exactly how they think and how they feel, because you don't want to get a lot of unsolicited emails. I would assume that you still do, but it's just being quite creative. When it comes to the things that you shouldn't be doing, well, once again, it really, really depends on the media outlet you're trying to reach. But if you do have female investors, if you have C-level executives, there's no shame in taking pride in that, right? So you should talk about it, and that's very, very welcoming.
And what not to do?
What not to do when it comes to diversity, right? So don't try to do things, once again, for the sake of just doing things. And I think especially when it comes, I guess, to slightly, bigger companies, bigger brands. I don't know if we take Dove's campaign from a couple of years ago, when a black woman was washing herself and then, she became white all of a sudden. So I assume that in Dove's team, there were not enough people that were actually quite diverse, and, they would have pointed out a problem with that. Same goes, I don't know, with Kendall Jenner, Pepsi, and Black Lives Matter campaign. So do not do things that are just gimmicky for the sake of just doing things, right? Once again, none of us are perfect. We just have to be very honest. And as Chris fairly said, it has to come quite naturally, right? Including women. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Something to add?
Well, yeah, again, another opportunity to think about building those networks, not necessarily when you need them, but sort of in advance, gradually starting to get to know journalists and understand the media space. It's worth reflecting on what areas of expertise you have, what areas can you speak to that are beyond just your company, your product. Are you in climate? Are you in social? Are you in GovTech? The areas that you can comment around. And we're talking again about media in a very traditional sense. Like, you're trying to pitch me to get me to write a story about you, but of course, media today, particularly from the point of view of companies, is far beyond that. They're generating their own content, whether you call that content marketing or organic copy or whatever. So there's opportunities there as well to pitch things like guest posts, to look at opportunities like building a brand around, Medium, a newsletter, Twitter, social, whatever we're talking about, that is more than just you hiring her to get my attention to write about you. That's certainly worth doing and can be very validating. And if it's the right publication like Financial Times or Sifted or someone like that, that's great both for visibility and your ego, but it's not the only option anymore. And so I think that has to be thought of, again, broadly in all your media options, how you create that strategy and what are your goals for each one. But I think there's an opportunity, again, to, it's cliche to say it, but build that brand of self, build a sort of reputation and a track record as an expertise without necessarily having me do that for you.
And I think, if you don't mind me adding, having and thinking about the peso model from the very beginning, so paid, earned, shared, and owned, is quite important. And as you said, thought leadership. You can share your expertise about the company that you've started. People are interested in how you've started, how you overcame those challenges. It does not necessarily need to be a guest post, for a particular media outlet. You can make the most of your LinkedIn, some snappy tweets on Twitter. So there's a lot of content that you can produce. But then once again, when it comes to pitching the media, there has to be a certain aspect of newsworthiness. And it's great, but then you can't end up, in Financial Times weekly, monthly, right? It's nearly impossible because there's that much newsworthiness and news you can kind of push out. So you have to look at a variety of different angles as well.
As you mentioned, challenges, my next question is about challenges in communicating diversity. What are the biggest challenges when you are communicating diversity as a PR, and what are the biggest challenges when you are writing about diversity as a journalist?
You want me to go? That's a very tricky question. Challenges when it comes to kind of PRing, diverse teams. Difficult to say and pinpoint like very few specific ones. But I do think sometimes, it might be stereotypes and prejudice, right? So that's the first one that comes to your mind. I always say that never think outside the box. Always think that there is no box at all. Once again, when trying to pitch something that has a diverse angle, we try to make sure that it's not a gimmick. We try to make sure that whatever we're trying to pitch to the media, whether it's going to be, I don't know, paid article or an earned media, that you have that authenticity with you. And that can be quite challenging because, dealing with a lot of startups, sometimes there's a lot of ego involved, and you just have to find ways to go around that.
I mean, frankly, as a guy being up here on stage talking about this, or as a journalist writing about it, I mean, the fear is that I make an ass of myself. Who am I to really talk about this? But also just avoiding the cliches, the sort of simplistic generalizations, leaning on the sort of generic explanations, like, the people cite for this stuff, like, oh, the pipeline, and oh, girls are interested in science, and et cetera, like trying to just do more than just repeat those generalities and dig a little bit deeper in terms of getting beneath those the surfaces, and also really listening to what people are talking about. I did last fall. I was moderating a panel of, again, it felt a bit awkward to me, but it was sort of women in climate change founders, and then I was the guy on stage at it was a women's startup conference, and so. But I found listening to them, like their stories, what they would say about the challenges they had in hiring and recruiting women as women founders, even for them, where this is like a top of mind issue in running their company and how they want to create the values of their company. The things they had to do themselves to get other women to recruit them, to think about salary, to raise issues internally. It was a struggle for them to build the diversity into their culture. So that was super instructive to me, just to get to hear them talking about those stories. But again, I think that's the key is trying to move beyond the generalities and the cliches to hear sort of more insightful stories and to really listen to those voices.
What can PR and media do together to make this world a better place in the context of diversity?
I think, as Chris just mentioned, it would be good to get started, without using cliches, right? So if a woman is, a founder, a lot of times, people will say, oh, she's very bossy, she's very bitchy or something like that. But probably this is not something you would use, when it comes to a male founder. Another thing, I guess, from PR perspective, and what we try to work with our clients is just to make sure that they have this support network built in from the very start, right? So companies and startups nowadays, they have so much potential into growing to something bigger. It's entirely up to them, how well they include diversity from the very beginning, from the inception of the company. So having a support network for women is extremely important, but as you said, it's also quite difficult because I think a lot of it goes back to like education, to schools. Like I finished school 17 years ago now, and there were very specific gender roles in my school, right? So we would be taught how to make sandwiches, whilst the boys will be taught, how to build chairs. And you would do that up to the age of you were like 17. And for me, it was always a little bit weird. Like, well, maybe I want to build, like a chair. You're like, I can't build, like I clearly can build a chair. Like, am I worse than any kind of guy who builds a chair? But I think once you're in that particular culture, for you, just becomes quite normal. So we definitely need to challenge those stereotypes. We do need to do more related to mentoring women. We need to do more trying to push women, to be in STEM. That's really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing worth mentioning here too, and that I find a challenge, is these things we're all talking about can be very different culturally across Europe. And so I've lived in, just my experience, I've lived in France for 8 years now, and I'm still sort of mystified by the state of gender relations and the way it gets talked about there. Just as an example, a major magazine just a few weeks ago, did a profile of a woman who's quite prominent in the ecosystem there, and the headline was basically to the effect of, this woman's in her mid-30s, yes, you can have a child and be a boss and be in tech all at the same time.
Oh, that annoys me so much. Would you ever ask that a dude, right?
Well, you wouldn't ask it of a dude, but even coming from the U.S., there was a kind of headline like, that people were writing in the 80s. And, in France, it's still, you hear these stories all the time. On one hand, there are aspects that are quite progressive. They have universal child care, which is for everybody, but of course I think benefits women who often do the majority of child care at home. At the same time, it's not unusual from friends, say women in their 30s going out to job interviews, to be asked, even by other women, are you sure you can handle this job? What about your kids? How's this move going to affect them? Like in the U.S., that is period against the law to ask about that stuff. In France, it's still pretty common to ask that. So there's, if I go across Europe, I have no idea about gender relations in Latvia or Lithuania or the Baltics or the Nordics. So, there's that other aspect of okay, how does that look differently in each culture, and are there specific challenges or ways that gets talked about that I would have no idea. As an American, not even as just a guy.
Okay, let's continue about these headlines. Where they grow up, why we are putting out such a shitty headlines still?
I mean, again, for me, that particular example is it's just a very French thing. Like if you go look on TV, for instance, there's still shows in France where the basic storyline is, oh my gosh, this is a woman in her 40s going back to the workforce and she has kids. Like that's the whole setup of the show. There's a popular police show that's the whole setup. Like, woman has 3 kids, she'd retired from the Paris police force. Her husband dies, so she has to go back to work. So she goes to some small town with her kids, and all the colleagues are like, oh my gosh, how is a woman in her 40s in the workforce? That was a show in the 70s in the US, a famous police show called Cagney and Lacey, where it was, oh my gosh, there's women police officers who are mothers. Like, so again, there's that cultural divide that's sort of still mystifying to me, and that gets reflected in the media. Again, in France, pageants are still a big story. Miss France is still like a big banner thing in mainstream media, front page stories. So navigating that stuff is strange to me, and I can't really explain it except that it's a cultural divide there.
But then that's beauty for a startup, right? If you're starting out, you can create your own culture, right? I don't know, if you're a female founder with 3 children, you can bring those children to work. Right? It's not a problem at all. So, and then you would want to have also quite nice and accepting environments for your employees, regardless whether those are males or females. So I think, once again, just because we talk a lot about startups, there's just so much potential to change and battle, these stereotypes that, a woman has to be at home with children, right? So a lot of times when I'm in some of the sales schools, someone would ask me, so who does Black Unicorn PR agency belongs to? And I was like, well, to me. And one gentleman actually asked me who bought it for me. And I was like, well, no one did. I could have just did it myself. And I got really, really offended. Then I was complaining to my mom about that. And then she said, it's a gentleman, and he's like late 50s, very kind of, he has these stereotypes about the fact that a woman like 30 in her 30s probably can't have her own business and stuff. So I do agree it will take a long time probably to try and wipe out all of these stereotypes. But for the time being, what we can do, obviously the journalists can do great reporting without just saying, this woman has 3 children and wow, she has a startup, right? We can do the same thing. Like, this gentleman just had 3 kids and he has a startup. So
yeah, and again, it's incumbent on me as a journalist to make sure that my network of sources is reflecting that. And we're fortunate in France. It sounds like I'm complaining about a lot about France, which is a very French thing to do, of course. But there are aspects. A lot of ecosystem leaders in France are women, at the moment. So we're very fortunate in that respect. And I don't know if all of you had a chance to see her. I think Deborah from Sista was on stage here earlier today. They're doing fantastic work. I think that's a real model for all of Europe, helping women build their own networks, learn from each other, mentoring about this topic, about other startup-related topics. So she's definitely worth talking to if this is a big area of interest to you. But as a journalist, it's great to be connected to them because I know that's a touch point where I can say, okay, I'm looking for someone, not because she's a woman, but I want to include women who's doing AI startup or who's doing this particular aspect of climate change, and they'll have in their network those contexts that they can surface very quickly.
What else we can do? One thing is just to search for women, to show them. What else what else we can do?
I think a lot of times with female founders, what we see, and probably this goes back to the very beginning of the conversation, that women are a little bit more timid, right? So they can't, not necessarily as ballsy, just going out and just saying like, we did this, we did that. Simply because a lot of women I speak to, they do have kind of this imposter syndrome. Okay, like I know that I know what I'm doing, but do I actually know what I'm doing? And if I'm going to be getting in touch with a journalist, will that make sense? So from my perspective, as a PR professional, we try to make sure that our, female founders are embracing exactly what they do. You can do some media training from that perspective because obviously, you can prepare different type of questions and just make sure that they feel confident and comfortable speaking, because this imposter syndrome thing it's really annoying, but it is there. So a lot of times I would assume that probably male founders can come up to you and say like, hey, I have this amazing story to pitch, and I would assume that it's less likely that a female founder would come to you and say like, I have this really, really cool story, I would like to talk to you a little bit more about that. Once again, simply because they were like, okay, so maybe I just want to be somewhere in the background, just doing my own thing. But we try, we can't really force female founders to do that, but we try to kind of give them the platform and the room, because it's really, really amazing.
Yeah, again, this is where I have to be a little bit careful, because I don't want to say, oh, well, all women are like XYZ, or, all males have bigger egos than women. But yeah, I mean, definitely see that sort of dynamic again. If I just am going by the data of my inbox or networking events, again, I've just been here a couple hours. I can walk around and see it seems like a great mix. I don't know the exact numbers of attendees or people on stage, but we're just a couple hours into it. I haven't seen all male panels yet. I haven't seen some of the traps that some of events fall into. But yeah, if I'm going back to this climate panel I did last fall, I mean, the stories I was hearing were amazing. Like, a woman would recruit another woman, and the woman just thought, oh, you can't really want me. I mean, am I really good enough for this job? And then they'd make them a job offer after they convinced them to apply, and the woman would just take it. And the CEO, female CEO, is like, no, you're supposed to then ask for more money than I'm offering, like walking him through this dynamic. And they were just talking about that. So yes, I want to be careful, but yeah, I think there's some element of putting your hand up, putting yourself forward, having that confidence, and again, I think one way to do that is building that network of female mentors, also females in the media, female journalists, to kind of build that knowledge and confidence.
One thing where diversity and communication about it is very important is when you are seeking for talent. How would you say how important from PR perspective is communicating about diversity when you want to find your next coworkers?
So I think there's kind of a couple of aspects, right? So I guess, when looking and seeking for talent, you would be looking to marketing more, right? So if you write a LinkedIn post, you can talk about, the numbers of females, like what you guys are doing, how diverse you are, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, if you're looking for a job, you will, you'll find that particular job, you'll find that particular company, and what you'll do is you'll Google them, right? And then you'll start reading some sort of news articles about them or thought leadership pieces. So you would be able to kind of, put this puzzle together, how exciting and probably how diverse this company is. But then, we have company blogs where you can talk about that. Once again, just make sure that on your website it's not kind of all pale on male, and probably I am getting into a trap here, right? But just to make sure that it's a very welcoming environment, because whenever you're applying for a job, you want to be accepted for who you are, no matter what kind of background, sex, ethnicity you are. So just those little things and kind of little breadcrumbs. What I think was quite fascinating is when Change Ventures, they raised a huge amount of money. They went to Sifted, and what they did with that is not just said, oh, look at us, how amazing, we raised all this money. They've also announced the women that are joining the fund. So, you just integrate that message. So it would not be, because VC world is still, can be a little bit, scary, because it's, once again, very male dominated. But if you have this accepting environment, and you see that there's a variety, so that's definitely welcoming.
By the way, I'll just put in a plug for Sifted, because I do some freelancing for them. And, if you look at their staff list, I want to say, maybe someone from Sifted's here, but I want to say at least on the journalism side, I think it's majority women. Certainly it's being run by, at this point, mainly two women, Amy and Eleanor, and they do a really good job of, I think, addressing some of the things we're talking about here, both writing about the topic, as you were suggesting, but also just normally highlighting women investors, both sometimes through lists, like top 45 female investors to follow on Twitter, but just the normal course of coverage, not highlighting this is a diversity story, it's a deep tech story, but if you look at it, there is a mix of sources in there.
So, could we wrap up, and what would be your advice when some founder wants to talk with media, what to tell about diversity and to get in media coverage?
So this whole diversity topic should be kind of intertwined in this whole news and storytelling, right? You can't just go to the media and say, like, we're very diverse, we're very cool, would you write something about us? Just be, and I said that probably one too many times, just be very honest, be very transparent. If your team, let's say, is not entirely extremely diverse, but there's some sort of baby steps that you can do in order to make it a little bit more diverse. Make sure that you include women, in your C-level executives. Make sure that there's good mentoring, throughout the company, because a lot of times, junior females, they might just, once again, feel a little bit intimidated, trying to get to the top. So it's not, that will sound probably like really horrible, but you would not want to use diversity as just the only thing, just to try and pitch the media for the sake of being in the media, right? Once again, you don't want to use it just a PR stunt, PR trick, just to get something out of it. You have to make sure that whatever you're doing has some purpose behind it and actually has, some hard facts behind it, because you can't just go around, shouting about diversity when in reality, if someone does a little bit more digging, which journalists always do, and they will find the truth.
Yeah, but in the same case, if you do have a distinct, let's say, benefits policy or strategy for enacting that kind of, attracting talent or keeping them on board, I wouldn't be afraid to highlight that. And always a good way to make a pitch is to tie whatever you're talking about into a larger trend, because we'll be very selective about the number of profiles of one person or company that we'll do. But, if it's tied to a broader trend about, 2 years ago it was work from home, work-life balance, promoting diversity, if you can sort of point to a larger trend there and saying, and we have this innovative solution around how we're doing it or mentoring or whatever, that's a great thing to put out. And I think also just having expectations about what you'll get. Again, this is sort of blanket advice from me about these things, but getting away from thinking about a transactional relationship with media or journalists. If you're coming to us at the moment where you need coverage to really push a product or a service that you're launching, and that's the first contact, it's probably a bit too late. Think about building those things for the long term, because I'm doing what I'm doing now, you're doing what you're doing now. Our roles will change over time. are what we're interested in will evolve, but those relationships are a thing, especially if you think you'll be in this in some fashion for your career. It might not be this startup I write about, but it's your next one. So think about, that relationship as a long-term thing. Don't have that expectation that if I don't write it now, that I hate you or that I, don't respect what you're doing or whatever. Like, the volume of stuff that we get pitched means that the stuff we actually cover is infinitesimally small.
Excellent final touch of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.